This week, Ian Anderson makes the most ironic of concept-y albums, which becomes the most concept-y of all concept albums, ironically. This week, Jethro Tull's Thick as a Brick. So, hello and welcome to A Sort of Young Person's Guide to Prog Rock. I am your host, Ian Prize. So, when last we left Jethro Tull, composed of singer, flautist, and songwriter Ian Anderson, guitarist Martin Barr, keyboardist John Evans, bass player Jeffrey Hammond, and joined for this album by Barrymore Barlow on the drums, they had just finished 1971's Aqualung, and the music press had declared that they thought it might be a concept album. So, feeling the need to poke back, Ian Anderson declared, fine, I will show you guys a concept album. So, over the course of 2 weeks in 1971, he would write snippets of music on the way into the studio that he and the band would string together into one 45-minute-long continuous song. They created a backstory that a young prodigy, Gerald Bostock, had written an epic poem and that the band had just simply put music to it. Additionally, to complete the illusion, for the album cover, the band assembled a village newspaper, the St. Cleves Chronicle, which announced both Gerald's poetry competition victory, amongst other small-town goings-on. Overall, this album is a high point, both for Prog and for Tull, and this is the pinnacle of Ian's rich lyrical ability, supported by the band's musical ability. So, like newborn babes exiting a dark and thorny forest, we've left the early days of Prog behind us, and we've arrived at what I consider to be the highest point of the classic era of Prog. So we're here to talk about my four wonders of Prog, starting today with Jethro Tull's Thick as a Brick. So this is probably the least complicated of a relationship I have with any album, and I really do find it flows smoothly from moment to moment to moment, and really doesn't strain under the pressure or the weight of Jethro Tull's arrangements or witticisms or wordplay. I find it to be pretty easy breezy and pretty fun top to bottom. So I'm joined by the entirely uncomplicated Ed Thomas. Hello, Ed.
Hello.
And the thick as a brick simpleton himself, Rufus Daw.
It's good to be here.
Hello, team. So, here we are, Thick as a Brick. I will start with Rufus. How'd you take Thick as a Brick?
I fucking love it. It's brilliant. I've never really listened to much Jethro Tull. I know that Aqualung is really big, and I know that this got pretty big as an album too, but it was quite an experience, and a good one at that, so yeah.
And Ed, Thick as a Brick.
Yeah, I love it. It's really good. I think this specific version we're talking about being the Steve Wilson remix.
Yep.
I prefer the original, and we'll discuss in more detail why. But I think for the purpose of the podcast, it's quite useful because you can section the various bits into.
Yeah, you wouldn't be able to do it otherwise, right?
Yeah. So for us in this world we're podcasting in, it's actually really helpful. But other than that, I would advise the listeners to probably just listen to the original. Ultimately, the actual idea of the album, I think, is brilliant. You know, these are guys kind of poking fun at prog. They're poking fun at Yes and the kind of overinflated ELP stuff, or how they saw it as overinflated. And I think what we get is, because they take their music seriously, but they don't take themselves seriously, it really is a joy to listen to, and you can hear they're having fun.
It's a fun mix.
Yeah, there's loads of joy in it. Yeah, there's humour in there that's quite subtle, and I think because it's so subtle, I think there's a lot of people out there who just completely miss it and take it as a really serious prog album. And I think for that reason, it's kind of perfect prog.
Yeah. For
a non-prog band who now are a prog band. But yeah, it's fantastic. I really love it.
I mean, I'd say, ironically, in making fun of a concept album, they nail a concept album.
Oh, yeah.
That was the concept. It's concept section.
That was the concept. I was going to say, I'm like 5 concepts deep. I think because the album musically is just so cohesive, as a sonic experience. But then every section in the song the one long song, he brings up some version of the adult world. So let's talk about that real quick. So I was like, this to me obviously has a theme. And whether or not he chose to make it have a theme, we debated ad nauseum on Aqualung. But I was going to say, I think in the fact that he started with this fake schoolboy, Gerald Bostock, who we talked about in the intro, and made it a long epic poem about the transition from youth to adulthood. And then every section in this long, long song explores some part of that theme. I actually think it's a very concept album.
He describes it in interview as the mother of all concept albums. Yeah, and I can see that.
Yeah. And I think because, again, through each section of this long piece, he talks about some version about adults being hypocrites or adult world being complicated or whatever it is. I think there's an obvious theme, and for me, the theme is transition to adulthood.
Or at least an 8-year-old's view of adulthood.
Yeah, as told by a 25-year-old.
Yeah, and I think he's talking about his own views on life, but through the eyes of an 8-year-old child.
Yeah, he's definitely drawing on like his own experiences as well as this sort of made-up scenario that Gerald's found himself in.
Yeah, and I was going to say, I think Ian Anderson said that by doing it as a joke and by doing it through this other character, he said he found himself more free to grapple with these thoughts poetically. And I was like, I think this is his finest lyrics, and in fact, probably some of the finest lyrics of any of Prog.
And then musical too, as well. Like, I mean, you can put in really heavyweight lyrics into a song, and it won't be fun to listen to. But they seem to tread the line quite well.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I wonder if, like, by describing
Gerald Bostock
as a genius 8-year-old, he's kind of alluding to the fact that he might be a genius himself,
Precocious.
Cheeky. Yeah. I think just the way that they're communicating who they are as a band and as people, the whole use of humour is so subtle. Yet, if you're familiar with things like Monty Python, you can see their deep cuts in the Monty Python world. Mentioning Biggles being a character in there, and I remember there's the Monty Python paperback, and it talks about how silly Biggles is. It's in there.
Again, he likens his work to Monty Python-esque ideas quite a lot, including Thick as a Brick. So that really scans. And
this is obviously for someone else's PhD thesis, but I was going to say, I think like Monty Python was obviously grappling, because they started, I think, in 1969, but they were, late 60s, early 70s, they were grappling with the same weird British quirks and society and class and, all these types of things through comedy, whereas obviously Jethro Tull is working on them through music, as was Genesis, as was Pink Floyd. I think the best of the best were working through Britishness and the school system and blah, 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 blah,
right,
through their preferred mediums.
They were through their own ways as well, I suppose. If you think about Pink Floyd, they, outside of the Syd Barrett stuff, they got very serious, didn't they? Yeah. And then these guys are quite
light and fun.
Satirical, I guess.
Yeah.
And then Genesis.
Whimsical.
Yeah, that scans. Yeah.
But this is interesting. It is satire and it's social commentary, which, again, we've talked about it before so much with prog subject matter, how it's never to do with social stuff. It's more to do with grand, whimsical themes from ancient history and stuff you're being taught in your boarding school. But it's always social commentary in Ian's work, and it's always deeper, even though it's often silly.
Yeah,
I find that very interesting, and I think it's the best way to make a point is to add a little humour.
Yeah, no, and I think this was humour without being joke songs, and so I think that's why it goes down so smooth.
It is literally like that lump of sugar to make the medicine go down,
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just probably my last point, the whole Monty Python thing. Even Thick as a Brick sounds almost like a Monty Python title.
I mean, I think it's a phrase as old as time. So obviously, for our American listeners, to be thick means to be dull, and as a brick is just to make it sound cool. For our American listeners, it's I believe a Northern English phrase that just means you're dumb. And with that, let's get this party started. So we're doing the Steven Wilson mix, which Ed will talk about in a second. But we are starting with track 1, Really Don't Mind, and See There a Son Is Born. So Really Don't Mind is just one of the best intros of all time, and it's so much like a mission statement, I guess, for this. So he's firstly inviting everyone in. I really don't mind if you sit this one out. Your words like a whisper, your deafness a shout. He's like an old-time bard before the audience saying, I'm about to tell you a 45-minute long tale.
I think it's interesting you refer to him as like a minstrel or a bard or something. With all Jethro Tull's work, I always hear that kind of medieval vibe in you know, like the modal arrangement of the melodies and stuff. It has that kind of thing I associate with medieval sounding music.
I think the thing that makes it very bard-ish, and we talked about this a lot in Aqualung, I think because it's very obvious that he has a vocal line and then they orchestrated around it. It has the feeling of traditional folk music where you're orchestrating to the vocals.
It's melodic, isn't it, rather than harmonic?
Yeah, it's super melodic.
Yeah.
I mean, actually, I'll get into this now. Jethro Tull's dynamics are out of this world. There's 5 of them, but they somehow go light and heavy, slow and fast, quiet and soft. And then they're really good at playing all in unison and then branching out, doing like 5 different things, then coming back to going perfectly in unison. And I think that means that you can sustain the length of this album, but it stays fun.
Yeah, I think this song, well, this section of song 1,
yeah,
like is a really good example of that in the, you know, kind of halfway through. You know, it starts with this really good acoustic guitar and the flute in the intros, like is that vibe, and then when the organ kicks in, it's so powerful.
Yeah,
and it keeps coming up. You'll have the drums and the organ or the power chords being hit bang on in unison.
Yeah,
and it's really rhythmically strong. And then because they're doing that, all the fluty elements or sometimes organy bits, anything that's
adornment,
twiddly,
yeah,
just dances over the top of it all, and it sounds so busy, but it's all so together at the same time because at least 3 instruments are always like dong dong dong, bang in time with each other. It just powers along with so much, you know, strength. But that's a common theme, that element of them doing that with the rhythm, and then dipping into something really light again. You'll hear the main elements are always the acoustic guitar, which is quite a boxy little sounding acoustic guitar that sits in a very specific frequency. You've got the Hammond organ, you've got the flute, you'll have the drums, and then the electric guitar is surprisingly heavy.
Yeah,
But those tones you hear all the way through the album, there's not much variation in that, but they do so much with those. It sounds like there's so much more going on, but it's really kind of just that. You know, you look at the instruments on the list of the album, there is other things on there. Obviously, there's like someone's using like a lyre and...
a clavichord.
You know, there's some violin at the end, and, you know, there is obviously other bits, but the main elements are those. I think Ian Anderson, you know, he would write on all sorts, and he would sometimes record little bits that would go in, and like he really would splice stuff into albums, but I'm not sure there's any of that going on in this album.
I think it was rehearsed live so that they could keep adding on and it would sound as continuous as it does. Yeah. So he would just come up with it on the way into the studio.
I think literally there's pieces that he wrote that morning.
Yeah.
And then they'd go and record it later on. But I think it sounds like they were in like a really good place as a unit and having fun and working together, and it was quite... You can imagine that sort of scenario being really nice to work in and being quite creative, but, you know, it doesn't sound like a typical environment to be writing stuff in the morning, then just expecting it to work.
It's very iterative, isn't it?
It's incredible.
And I was going to say, I think that's the working style that makes this such a fun and light album, because I think Ian Anderson obviously came up with a handful of very fun melodies. So all of the melodies on this album are just great. And then they filled them in. So I don't think there was the weight of like we're going to come up with Tales from Topographic Oceans or some of the later like super crazy prog that we get into. I think this was Ian Anderson came up with like 10 to 12 really beautiful melodies, and then they filled them in.
I also think we're looking at it from a lens of people creating an album in the way that they normally would, song by song, right? Whereas maybe this is just a generalized approach to if you want to create a 45-minute song, which is essentially what they did. Maybe it's not that surprising, I suppose. Maybe this is the way you have to do it if you're to
pull it off,
constantly make an evolving song. You can't just be like, okay, this is A section, this is B section, how do we merge it into the two? It has to be a bit more granular than that.
Yep. And you have to just keep adding and adding, and as you say, kind of iterative.
This is kind of what I dislike about this particular revision of the album, is that it feels like someone's trying to separate something that was a unit. And I always, one thing I love about albums is that you're listening to an album. You can pick a song you like out of the album and hear it on its own, but an album's written to be listened to from start to finish. And it was clear, this is the best example ever of that in its original form. The only break is to turn the thing over.
I was just going to say, I mean, this leans into what I guess everyone would expect, but the album in general made number 5 in the UK and like topped on Billboard charts for 2 weeks. They released Thick as Brick in an edited version as a single, and it just absolutely bombed. In both the American and UK charts. Even Ian talks about it saying, of course, that's never what it was meant to be.
I mean, funnily enough, I still listen to the Steve Wilson remix. We're not going to talk about it, but like I like it as a mix. But I still listen to it back to back to back. Like, as in, I think it is weird to listen to each of these chunks as individual songs. I'd say they're still 2 20-minute long songs, and that is how I experience them.
Oh, yeah.
So I guess the one other thing on the fact that they just set this up really well to be kind of a light and fun song. So obviously the music is light and fun. And I think the lyrics, so we start with some pretty iconic lyrics. And Nick mentioned this back in the Aqualung thing about Ian Anderson laughing at his own lyrics. And he does that in a sense, because he says, I'm a bad dream that I just had today. And you shake your head and you said it's a shame. And that's the lyrical version of like a shrug. And I think it sets it up nicely that we're not in for deep, crazy philosophical whatever. We're in for Monty Python.
Yeah.
And so I think like already I'm track 1 technically, and I'm sold. I'm loving the lyrics, loving the arrangement, and loving the melodies. Their next album, A Passion Play. So they're going to try and repeat this trick again where they do one really long song and it's too heavy.
I feel like this is a prime example of whimsical prog done right. So often you can go too far whimsical, and we've discussed that with other albums before. And equally the other way, you can just maybe not have any whimsy in there, and it's just a bit too serious, and it's a bit too up itself. But this seems to do that and also be just a really nice set of songs to bop along to.
So I think we creep then into See There a Son is Born, which is the next part of this song. And I love it. Blows out of the kind of the jigging part and blasts into the creeping run, like the creeping ascending run. So I take this as the boy is starting to grow up and he's realizing that life is going to get complicated. And so I feel like we've got kind of the two parts lyrically of the song where they're saying, come listen to my tale about how the world is complicated. You wise men don't know how it is to be thick as a brick. And now, see there a son is born. And you're like, oh boy, life is about to get complicated. And that sets us up for the rest of the album.
Which is also an excellent insert of the title. Like, it was very craftily done. Sometimes it's a bit sort of hammed in there, isn't it?
It feels like a joyful part of the arrangement, though, doesn't it? It's not like, oh no, stuff's going to get complicated. It's like there's an emotional excitement there, a joyful emotional excitement to that idea, I think.
Well, and I think that's adolescence. It's a lot of emotions and a lot of like, oh my God, the world is about to get very complicated. That's not necessarily a bad or daunting thing. It's just a lot. And it feels like a rushing organ build. That's how I experienced most of my teens, was a
Rushing organ
An
build.
intense organ riff.
It's sort of like that build-up that you get at fairground rides with the Hammond. I think predominantly that's the sound of the Hammond organ coming in there. But like as you say, that sort of that organ build, it puts you on edge, and you get ready for the poet and the painter.
Yeah, so this is the poet and the painter, casting shadows on the water, the doer and the thinker, no allowance for the other. Yeah, what do you think about this part?
Well, first off, it's spooky as fuck when it hits.
Okay, yeah.
I guess it's unexpected, but it's pretty cool. It was like some sort of dissonant chord. I don't know, drummers doing music theory never goes well.
Speaking of the drummer, I think, this is the first album with the new drummer. This is where we're really hearing the band sound different. I wonder how much it's to do with the way they're playing with his rhythm. Maybe not so much with this song specifically, but yeah, this drummer has changed the sound of this band, I think.
So Barry Moore Barlow is his name. This guy was never on my radar at all. And I was just doing some reading. And yeah, wow, okay, he's really respected. He was called the greatest rock drummer England ever produced by Bonham himself, and was also considered by Plant and Page a possibility to replace Bonham after Bonham died. Although obviously they broke up instead. But wow, I mean that's some high praise from some people, some legendary rockers of the time. So
I mean, I think obviously he doesn't have as heavy of a drum sound as Bonham, but I think he skitters in such interesting ways. In the same way Bonham does, where I think it's, again, never just an obvious fill.
Playing to the music. I've said it again and again.
At the beginning of the second half, the section, See the Man Is Born, he has the most incredible power drum solo in that track. It just goes on for ages. I felt like that was one of the parody bits. I felt like they were kind of mocking...
Yeah, mocking drum solos and stuff.
Yeah. Because it felt like it was it started off it really hit hard and it hit home and it did it really well, and it was just why is it still going?
And yet Rush still did everything they did 10 years later.
Yeah.
But yeah, you really hear his chops in that one, and yeah, I can hear why people would say such good things.
He's a good player.
Yeah.
For sure.
The guitar work on this song I absolutely dig so much. It's really quite heavy. I find quite interesting the amp, the high watt, is quite a woody sounding, big 100-watt stack thing with a treble booster into it, and he's playing a custom Les Paul, a fake one. But essentially that's the same kind of setup that Tommy Iommi uses in Black Sabbath. And you can hear the similarity. I think you hear it more towards the end of the album, but on this track you really hear it. And there's those sort of descending lines in this track. It's really quite heavy. I really like it.
Yeah.
Absolute killer guitar tone. Yeah, Martin Barr. His guitar and Ian Anderson's flute are similar level of skill.
Yeah.
And I think they complement each other so well. But I think on this particular track, the guitar line outshadows kind of everything else, I think.
Yeah.
I think it's really good.
The flute play is really awesome as well, to be fair, giving his credit.
And actually, I know that he technically overdubbed the flute, because you can hear it overlap with his vocals a little bit. But actually, this was the part of the album where I really realized Jethro Tull does not do many overdubs. And maybe for practical reasons, they probably do some overdubs. But in terms of how they've arranged their songs, they make it sound like there's only ever 5 people in the room at any given time.
Yeah, and I think this actual remix of the album does sort of bring elements of the playing out in a different way to the original. Normally when someone re-releases an album, it's often a remaster, isn't it? Where they've just taken the finished product and they've EQ'd it a little bit and put it out again. This isn't that. They've literally gone to the multi-track recording and they've
Teased it apart.
They've changed where things are. Yeah, and there are places where they have literally cut bits out and pasted them over other bits. When you hear it, I find it clangs with me because I've heard it differently on the original.
Sure.
But I think, when people are overdubbing things, because of the way this is mixed, it's more obvious than on the original. I feel everything's a little bit more spread out in this.
Yeah.
And again, not necessarily in a comfortable way. I feel like things are kind of too separated in the stereo spectrum. Listening with the headphones, I find, why is it over here in this ear? I'm starting to get ear fatigue and stuff. Whereas I never had that with the original. It just all felt...
A blob of beautiful sound.
A nice wall.
Yeah, it felt nicely balanced. You know, when you're saying about the overdubs of the flute, and stuff, I don't feel like it was as obvious before.
Yeah, I mean, I only noticed it because I noticed it. As in, for me, nothing really stood out. I just on this song was the first time I'd really thought, actually, they're doing a lot with a little. You know, it really is just those 4 musicians and then Ian Anderson in the room, and it sounds full. And I think that's because they've got like the guitar creeping over here, and they got the flute over here, and they've got organ down the middle, and all that type of stuff. I think that fills out the sound quite a bit. So I think in terms of where we are poetically, what do you think this part talks about? I mean, funnily enough, so my brain is so addled with Prog that I had always heard it as the old man challenges the sun, and thought about like the old man, you know, challenging Apollo to come down and fight him or something.
He's just shouting at the sun. Not another day.
No, I was like, God, man, I've listened to it just too much Prog. So, what do you do when the old man's gone? Part 3 of Thick as a Brick.
I'd say this is the best example of... You know, I was talking about how like the drum hits and the power chords are like totally in unison.
Yeah.
They do that to give you that rhythmical structure, and then everything just twiddles over the top. Like, this is the marching beat bit of the album. Yeah, I could just listen to this bit over and over. Yeah, I really love this section. It just feels really powerful, and it just, as a band, as a unit, I think they really work solidly together. And the idea that that's a new drummer with the band, I find quite interesting. That they could all be in sync so quickly and as a band, you know.
No, I think you're right. This part with the unison beats, and also with the unusually placed beats, and I think so. The end of this part, when they start in with the organ, that part. So obviously, this way of making a song presented a very obvious challenge, which is how do you do transitions? Because you can't do one thing for 20 minutes. So how do you transition between all these parts? And I feel like they found all these clever ways to do transitions. And I feel like this was the one I probably remember the most, where they do the organ and piano call and response, you know, which they actually loop back to in a symphonic way at the end. But they do all these like little tiny bits. And I actually think we talked about this in Aqualung with like Wondering Aloud and Slipstream. They do these small little acoustic parts. And obviously this is even smaller. So this is now in the, you know, like 40-second range. But I actually feel like having really small bits that are kind of non sequiturs, they're not part of the song in any real way, keep it fun and interesting the whole way through.
And they're all doing it together. It's not like anyone's off or anyone's taking a little jaunt on their own. It's done together as a unit. It's really cool. It's just a tight band.
You know, I really wouldn't be surprised if Supertramp got a lot of influence from some of these songs, but especially this one.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
I get a lot of Prime of the Century vibes, for lack of a better term, from What Do You Do When the Old Man's Gone. I mean, you know, as always, it's the mix of the Hammond organ and the acoustic guitar, etc., etc. That's obviously a Supertramp staple, but I think it all comes together in a very similar way. Because, of course, arrangement is key. That's where the similarities start to get a bit spooky.
I've never seen Jethro Tull and Supertramp in the same room.
Yeah, it's a weird pairing. I mean, it's around about the same time as well. I mean, Supertramp got together 1971, and then Crime of the Century is 74, so it's a little bit later.
I think it's another band that's full of people who are taking their music seriously and not themselves too seriously. Yeah, it's not surprising you've got like a similar energy. Yeah, similar time, similar equipment, similar. You know, it's that's interesting.
So we now. Oh God, I don't want to do that transition. It's like, and now we curl our toes in fun. After the old man's gone.
Curl your toes?
You just curl them. How else do you hang on to the branches?
Yeah.
I mean, you guys all sleep in a cave upside down, right?
I guess there's a sexual undertone to that.
What, curling your toes in fun?
That's what I got from this.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the name, but then I don't feel like he really explores that much in the song.
No, in the lyrics there's no real...
Again, it's the guise of an 8-year-old boy, remember?
Yeah, that's true. I feel like so this part is probably the most self-consciously proggy of all of them. And like you've got the light, almost offbeat drumming, the piano, the glockenspiel, crazy dynamics, and then you have a flute solo.
Yeah, the whimsy meter's at 10.
I also feel like this is one of the tracks where the Steve Wilson mix feels different to the original quite a lot. So, as soon as the acoustic guitar comes in, like normally you'd imagine that to be more straight down the middle, but it's kind of separated very wide. And you can hear, it's the same instrument, but it's like delayed into both ears. It just feels, I don't know, it doesn't sit right with me, and it feels kind of lopsided. It feels uncomfortable.
I mean, I think because you've got more instruments. I don't know if you actually have more instruments, but you've got more non-band instruments. There we go.
Yeah, and I feel like that you wouldn't have heard them quite so clearly in the original mix. If you A-B'd them, I don't think it would be quite so obvious. And I guess I don't think that's, I'm talking about it in, it sounds like I'm talking about it in a negative way. I am. But it's only because but it's only because when the first way you hear something is always the correct way.
Yeah,
it's just different, isn't it?
Yeah, if you heard this version first, you might think the original would be a bit weird. But to me, this sounds a bit like jarring. But it's only because I'm expecting to hear something else. But I am hearing more of those bits and maybe that's because they wanted to make more of a feature of those parts in this song that you describe as being self-consciously prog.
Oh, I think you needed the really kind of gentle dynamics for this, because it's like it really slows down and becomes gentle until it builds at the end with Childhood Heroes.
Gets a bit triumphant.
I think this part's, for me, the most obvious about the hypocrisies and disillusionments of the adult world. And again, like I really actually got something from the lyrics here. And I think this used surrealism to great effect. Obviously, talking about Superman for president, Robin saved the day, all that type of stuff.
It's such a simple answer to adult problems as well, isn't it? Just have Superman in charge.
Yeah, but he doesn't care about humanity.
And, being disappointed about Biggles not being there on Saturday, like that's some Monty Python something. But yeah, like I say, I think maybe it's an innocent sort of understanding of adult problems,
It's the 8-year-old's understanding.
Yeah.
Yeah.
To place your heroes in these roles that you're seeing adults.
No, and I was going to say, I think also as a child, hoping that someone's going to come save you, like that you're apart from society and you're hoping that someone else is going to come and just fix it. And this is the complexity of growing up. Sorry for all of our 8-year-old listeners. This is the complexity of growing up.
Bubbles blown.
I came here to tell some truths, some hard truths to 8-year-olds. Sorry, bud. Superman's not real, and he's not running for local government.
No.
The other thing I really like on an arrangement level, I love when people do solos over building verses. So at the very end, the flute solo happens over a crescendoing verse. And it brought me back to the end of Music Box in Genesis when he's saying, touch me, touch me, touch me. And Steve Hackett's going, wheelie, wheelie, wheel. Oh, God, I love that.
Yeah, it's just heightening, isn't it? It's what you do in an orchestra. The instruments on the higher end of the frequency spectrum just start getting busier. It generates like tension and agitation in the body.
And builds to that crescendo. And I think, again, to have, then you've not just got a voice building, you've got a second instrument building. And I think the tension between those two. Ooh. So, part 5. See There, A Man Is Born. We flipped the album over now, so we're technically on the second half of this song. So this is See There, A Man Is Born. And the first 3 or 4 minutes of the song, they're trying to restart the song again. And they have all these false starts. So the drums start picking up and the organs start picking up. And there's someone just mumbling in the background. Do you think there's a significance to them trying to restart the song but failing?
Look, I totally hear what you're saying. It's like you're revving the car back up again. It's stopped. You flip the record over, you start it, and it's...
And they're trying to restart the song.
Yeah.
And then they do with a hard cut to clear white circles. So they just completely say, hut, and then they start the song again, and it's just really, again, a very clear kind of acoustic-y doodly 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 doo.
I honestly don't understand the symbolism in this song. I know it's there, but I can't peel it apart, really. I mean, like, I know you can, like, point out if they're talking about a man is born and they're talking about overwhelming responsibility, there's some degree of sort of welcome to adulthood, it's shit.
Yeah.
Sort of underlying narrative there. But outside of that, it's really difficult to figure out what it is really trying to say. And then I guess what I was going to say on top of that is maybe it's not that symbolic. Maybe they just thought, oh, you know what's crazy and anxious and
like disorienting,
sort of chaotic. Well, but yeah, disorientating.
Yep.
Becoming 18 years old. And so that was just their representation of it. Maybe there's nothing more to it than that.
What are you telling us, Gerald? What are you saying to us?
I was going to say, I think there's an actual fire alarm. No, it is legitimately fire alarming.
Why are you sat there then?
I don't see a fire.
So you're not going to go until you've seen the fire in the flash?
I think the only thing is that it's going to pick up on this microphone.
Is that your only concern? There's just like a little pile of soot on his chair.
Yeah.
So after some technical difficulties, I am back for Legends and Believe in a Day.
The legend is back.
The legend has returned. Legends and Believe in a Day. So it starts with a little tiny transition, and this is like one of those transitions I was speaking about earlier that weave through this album and make it feel kind of fun and cohesive, but keep it interesting. But then we start in with the long dirge, and it comes close to feeling repetitive. And it's the only time I'd say in the album where I worried, are they going to do this to me? Are they going to make it repetitive? And then I was like, ha ha ha, this is being an adult. I know, I went there. This is the slow dirge of the rat race or whatever. And also like looking back and thinking, do you believe in a day?
I completely agree. I think the one problem is that it makes it a difficult song to listen to in comparison to the rest of the album.
But I was going to say, so the one thing that Ian Anderson does in this song, and I was thinking about it that he's so good at, so he drags and rushes the way he sings. And I think that type of ear candy actually keeps you interested in what he's up to. And I was actually thinking about Wondering Aloud. And Wondering Aloud should be a just normal 3/4 song. So like Wondering Aloud. But he does the like a wondering aloud, then kind of little break, da-ba-da, da-da. And I think because he stops and starts and speeds and rushes and slows and whatever, instead of just singing it straight 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, I think it keeps your ears interested.
And yeah, from what I understand, he usually will write his lyrics first and put his music onto the lyrics. So it'd explain why it does what you've just described. Once he's seen his words on paper, he will be playful with the way he delivers them. And then you can see if you then transpose your music on top of that, it can be more interesting in a timing manner, less what you'd expect.
And I think that's the thing that keeps you interested in all types of music is, if it's too straightforward of a song, you're like, okay, that's fine. But if it's intriguing, as this is, I think it does get you through it or hook you.
I really like this song, actually. Like Rufus just mentioned there about it being, the adult thing. It's like there is definitely like an emotional shift here. I think a lot of the previous tones have been very joyful, if not obvious joyful, like using major tonalities and stuff. There's a mournful vibe here.
Yeah.
And it kind of reminded me of the kind of Justin Hayward songwriting style. And I was there thinking, oh, is this them maybe parodying that?
Okay, yeah.
There's a few times where like he holds a note overly long. And I'm wondering, is he kind of poking fun a little bit there? I don't know, but it feels like maybe there is a little element of that.
There's a nod to the Moody Blues.
Yeah.
I see what you're saying, yeah.
But regardless of that, I think the Martin Barr element of this song I really like. The sort of descending guitar tones. And again, you really hear that Sabbath sound. Like it's very clear that sounds like the Tommy Iommi setup as well, which I'm a big fan of. So I just really love that tone.
Yeah.
It's tone for days. I love it. even with that, you've still got the organ twiddling in one side, and you're still allowing for these strange time changes as well. It's a really interesting song, but I don't know if I like it as a song. I just like the sounds on it, if you know what I mean. I feel like they are maybe poking fun a little bit with the songwriting style, which kind of, I don't know if I like that they're doing that, if that is what they're doing. But it feels like they are. I don't like that they are, but I love the sound of the instruments.
God damn it, Justin Hayward's my hero too.
yeah. Basically, that's how I'm feeling about it.
I feel like the problem is the context is the album, right? And that we've enjoyed really fun, whimsical songs throughout the album. As we say, we have this dark with the light. But something that I've only really started to appreciate is that the context is really important. So perhaps if you were to hear Legends and Believe in the Day in the context of a film or another piece of media, perhaps it would fit perfectly. It just feels as if there's a big shift in tone with this song compared to the rest. But if you were to place it in another piece of media where that tone matched, perhaps it would be perfect.
Yeah.
You know, it's something always to bear in mind with songs that do sway very far from what the rest of the album sounds like.
But to that point, I think they needed to do something like that because you need to have some dark.
Yeah.
Because it's actually been very light so far.
For sure. Yeah, I think it like absolutely does that. But I wouldn't be surprised to hear that song being played in a funeral procession in some random art house film. Do you know what I mean? It's got that feeling to it.
Again, yeah, maybe in a Sabbath album.
Yeah.
So I think about this with Rush's 2112 and Close to the Edge. So Yes's famous Close to the Edge. I think there's a part in all long songs that you go into the cave.
Yeah.
And it needs to be quiet and sedate.
I completely agree. This is the dark for the light of the rest of the album. Yeah.
Yeah. Then you build through Tales of Your Lives, where, and this is probably the most frantic song, where it's building and building and building to the crescendo. And so Tales of Your Life is skittering drums. I think this is probably some of the best drum work. The flute solos going doodly 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 doo. And the lyrics are really frantic. And it gallops into the final climax of the album, Childhood Heroes, the reprise. So this has my single favorite moment in this album, maybe Tull's career, maybe one of my favorite moments in Prog of all time, and that is the little orchestral break. So this was done by D. Palmer was his name, and he was their orchestrator and would go on to be their keyboardist, actually. But I think, if I'm hearing it correctly, I actually think it's a rehash of the organ transition from earlier, but like that like that lush organ kind of chamber sound. Oh. And I think because it's only 20 seconds long, it makes me want more.
Yeah, interesting.
Sort of like an overture of sorts.
Yep, an overture at the end.
It's funny, it's like when I think of this album, that's the first side is the fun bit, and the second bit is like, but then the last 10 minutes, it's the most prog bit of the whole album. It's just fabulous. Like, there's so much going on. And I think if you can imagine them playing this as well, it must have been an absolute blast. You know, like there's so much like time changes and stuff going on, but they're all doing it together.
So interestingly about that, they only ever played the first half, like a truncated version of the first half.
Really?
And I think it's because this second half is so heavy and confusing. Because obviously you've had the skittering intro.
Must have been hard.
Yeah, like you've kind of got the skittering intro, you've got the dirge. Now you've had a crazy like galloping build, and now you've got an orchestral break.
Interesting.
And that's a lot. And I think it covers a lot more ground in a variety sense.
I'm thinking of that Tales of Your Life section. Yeah. So when I heard that, that's the first thing I was thinking is, oh, that must be fun to play. It's surprising that they wouldn't go on to do that.
I think it was because it was so hard to play. And I think, I bet they you have to try really hard to, as you say, play in unison all these complicated parts.
But yeah, the time signatures are changing all the time through it. Or it feels like they are anyway. That must have been really tricky. I feel like if you'd learned how to play that, you'd want to do it again.
Yeah. You'd think so. I mean, I think they did take this on tour, the next year. But like, you know, in terms of their live repertoire, I think they only ever brought in bits of the beginning of Thick as a Brick, which makes sense. That's the most pleasant, easiest thing. And then when, you know, I think then when you have a career that's like 50 years long, you do have to start picking, you know, because you could just play all of Aqualung and all of like Benefit or whatever, and then that's a whole set. So I think you have to start making hard decisions.
Yeah. Interesting. But yeah, like you say, that there's that kind of orchestrated element towards the end of it where you hear like really quite lush strings. It's only for a little tiny segment, and you've never heard it anywhere else in the album.
It has always been very jarring. Like, it is literally, as I was saying, it's 20 seconds of just like what's happening.
Yeah. I think it's kind of cool that it does it in this version. That it's like it's kind of like because it's
blares.
I was like, was that even there before? I didn't notice it so much. So what have they done here? And it's just because it's so well separated. But yeah, it's really interesting.
So yeah, and then we end on the Childhood Heroes reprise, and it's basically just, so where are all your childhood heroes? And I think you're an 8-year-old looking back on your life, and you're saying, what was going on in society this whole time? Like, what was the answer to all of this? So Biggles, for our American audience, because he was something I knew because I grew up on Monty Python. He's just a British childhood hero. So he's a fighter ace from World War I who went on a bunch of comic book style fun adventures. I think he fights the Nazis again in World War II. So he's just like a dashing fighter pilot, you know, very like British hero. So he gets chucked in here. I didn't know what the significance of a paperback edition of the Boy Scout Manual is. No idea what that's about. That sounds British boyhood something or other.
Well, that's what made me think of, you know, Monty Python's kind of paper book. So so that their sort of book that they published, and Biggles is in there. There's a story about Biggles being very silly. Yeah. So I don't know if it's some Monty Python deep cut.
Yeah.
I like how in this there's more emphasis on the little boxy acoustic guitar he plays.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that makes it more fitting that it's like a childlike bit. Something about that sound, that little boxy acoustic guitar,
like brings it back to yeah,
it just kind of makes it quite, I don't know, something quaint about it.
In a general sense, another arrangement thing I really enjoy when they do at the very end, when you bring it all the way back down and you do one final verse, just you and the acoustic guitar. Like, that's just one of my favorite arrangement tricks. And again, because we've gone huge, and then at the very end, just do the final verse again. Just him and an acoustic guitar. And
because of the type of instruments that they have in the band typically, it really lends itself to accentuated dynamic elements. You know, he always plays that little acoustic guitar. It is quite, I think it's a Martin O size, so it's less, like, you could call it like a parlour guitar. That flute, organs for your massive sounds, and then, you know, Martin Barr with his hi-wat. It's like there's so much dynamics with those things.
So much range between all of those, yeah.
Yeah, it's just good prog.
Fabulous. And then we end on the thesis statement. Your wise men don't know how it feels to be thick as a brick. And again, like, I love the full loop.
Yeah.
The full circle. That's, again, another fantastic arrangement trick if you start and end on the same song, like Sgt. Pepper's or Animals. Fabulous. So that was the tracks of Thick as a Brick, as it were. But obviously we all experienced this as one continuous song. Like, I think this is an album that feels continuous. Do you guys have any real thoughts about how they did that?
Well, just from having read about how they approached it, I think what makes that work in this sense, I think, is the speed that they recorded the album, perhaps. You know, if you've got guys in a room, I think there's like 2 weeks practicing and then a few weeks recording, and that's it.
Yeah.
They sounded like they're having fun together. Like, they're all on the same page, aren't they? I think if you're putting songs together that you've been writing for a few years and then start stapling it all together, you can make it sound like this, but it would be laboured. I feel like this is still quite organic, isn't it?
I mean, this sounds like they wrote one song and then played one song, and it does sound like that. And I think that was actually my grand theory. I think that's why. I think because Ian Anderson came in with bits, then they rehearsed the bits, then they recorded the bits.
Yeah.
And I think the fact that they did that continuously.
Oh, I was just going to say, it just seems like a natural progression of the way in which they decided to make the album. I would be very surprised if there was a lot of thought that went into it. Simply going off of the way they describe the creation of the album. And as we've touched on, the sort of iterative, granular process that they did it in. So
yeah,
I also feel like maybe they had to make it interweave from section to section. It was necessary for it to sound any good. I almost feel like it was an additional song making experience for them in a way, and one that they could probably just call on their ability to play live in order to do that. Like, every musician out there basically knows how to string songs together, because they usually do when they play live. I mean, obviously there's gaps and stuff, but
and I think that was the trick on this album, is that there's no gaps.
Yeah.
Like, they just start playing the next one and they figure out how to do that organically. And I was going to say, I think it builds on the thing that they had set up in Aqualung, as I had talked about on Aqualung, where it's Ian Anderson's beautiful melodies, vocals, and they fill in around him. And I think, it just builds on the Aqualung thing very naturally. I had mentioned this at the beginning, but it's funny that the next album, A Passion Play, they'll do this same thing again, where they're going to try and do one continuous 40-minute song, and it's too heavy, and it crumbles under the weight. And it's like, you could have gone too far, and I don't know what it would take to go too far, but I think you could just add too much in, and then it becomes long and draggy. I think this had the lightness of the lyrics, the lightness of the music, and the variety in dynamics and kind of orchestration.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
So they did Thick as a Brick too, right? This is something they did in 2012, because I haven't heard it. Was that also one continuous song in the style of Thick as a Brick?
No, so I think I've heard it exactly once, and it didn't frankly grab me.
Yeah.
As far as I recall, they did 4 songs, which are the 4 alternate futures of Gerald Bostock. So that's another high concept album.
What happened to Gerald?
You know what? I don't think that's in the lore. Yeah.
What?
What?
What? I always find it quite interesting hearing, for example, with this one, the thing that I think about the most is like all the weird production elements. When you compare this version to the original version, I start going down a rabbit hole when I'm listening to it in that regard. Whereas, yeah, you may not have even noticed that stuff.
I definitely, upon this re-listening, because this is now one I've listened to hundreds of times, upon this re-listening, I think the bit I probably got more of was the adolescence transition story that he was telling. And that was the element that jumped out to me more this time around. And again, I think in the way of all great concept stuff, he doesn't shout it. He just sings about various aspects of growing up. And in this case, uses a lot of surrealist imagery and almost medievalist imagery as well. But it hangs together as a conceptual arc for me on an emotional level, and then on a musical level. But my actual experience is I put on the headphones and I just ride away.
Yeah.
I just really like the content. I really like what they've written about. I think it's different but similar. The actual content of what he's talking about, the sort of journey to adolescence and adulthood, is somewhat new as a sort of lyrical topic for me, at least. But I think it also plays on very similar prog themes. I mean, there's always been this Lewis Carroll style world that prog likes to paint, this whimsical world that prog likes to paint, and they do it well whilst keeping it kind of rocking and fun to listen to. Yeah. And I think that's why you yourself, Ian, can just plug it and float away. It allows you to do that. There are songs where they play on those similar themes and you just can't do that. So I think we really should give it credit for that reason alone.
Light and fun.
And it's funny, isn't it? You'd imagine, like, on paper, this would just fatigue your senses. But it doesn't, does it? It weaves you through the story, yeah. I think I used to think that I preferred the earlier Jethro Tull, the more blues rock element, more psychedelic stuff. I'm starting to think I prefer the later, more proggy Jethro Tull now. I don't know. I'm changing, yeah.
You've changed. You've gone on your adolescent journey.
Maybe.
Your very own organ build. So, that was 1972's Thick as a Brick. This has been a sort of young person's guide to prog rock, and I have been your host, Ian Prize. I want to thank my guests, Ed.
Pleasure.
And Rufus.
May your bricks be thick.
I don't want thick bricks.
Find us on Prog Pod. And if you have any longer thoughts, queries, or questions, feel free to email at helloprogfrog@gmail.com. So, Thick as a Brick would do even better than Aqualung, and Jethro Tull would go back into the studio and try and follow it up with Passion Play, another enormous song split over two sides of an LP. However, that did only okay commercially and did very poor critically. So they would go back to the prog well twice more to try and do kind of concept-y albums. But then, in the late 70s, Ian Anderson would throw up the entire chessboard and start again. Is that a metaphor? Anyways, Ian Anderson would wipe the slate clean.
Nice.
And start again on the folk trilogy, starting with Songs from the Wood, which we will follow up on in a while from now. But next week, someone's getting themselves into a heaping helping of trouble. We rejoin the Genesis Boys with Selling England by the Pound. And he grew up to become Tony Blair. Dun dun dun!